So if we're thinking of using one of these types of targeting for poor households, what we need to do is first ask, well, do poor households actually consume small quantities of water? Do they live in slums? Do they use stand posts? In other words, we want to think about the characteristics, what we know about the poor, and what we want to do with the targeting, and see if there's a match. Pulling this all together then, let's look back at our population. Do subsidies reach the poor? Again, the red X's, those households are not eligible for either consumption or connection subsidies because they don't have access to the network. The blue crosses, the next line down, they were eligible for the connection subsidy, but some of those households may not be targeted for the connection subsidy. They may not meet the targeting criteria, or they may themselves decide not to connect. And that's what those orange circles are on top. So those 4 households with the orange circles are not going to end up receiving the connection subsidy. And finally, I've added another row of black X's below. These are households who do have connections, but for whatever reason are not targeted or don't meet the targeting criteria to get a consumption subsidy. So they're not going to get a consumption subsidy. In this particular case, you can see that we're left over with very few poor households eligible for the consumption subsidy, and only 2 end up being eligible for the connection subsidy. Now let's think about IBTs. What does all this mean for increasing block tariffs, which, as I told you, is the most common form of subsidy? First, the bad news. Like all other consumption subsidies, increasing block tariffs suffer from what I call an access handicap. That means that because many households don't have access and don't have connections, it simply means many poor households will be ineligible for this subsidy. No matter how good a subsidy it may be, many of them will not even begin to qualify because they simply don't have access and a connection. Also, in the case of IBTs, if subsidies are only going to households that have meters, meaning that they're actually able to be billed with an increasing block tariff, then even fewer households may be eligible for this subsidy. Another piece of bad news for increasing block tariffs is that poor households are not necessarily low-volume consumers. So the whole idea of an IBT is that we expect that those who receive the largest discount are those who consume the least, and we think that those are the poor. But if you look at this data here, this was, we collected this about 5 years ago, sorry, even 3 years ago, let's say. Of all the cases we could find where we found information on consumption by quintile, okay? The poorest quintiles are quintile 1 and 2. And if you look and see in these different cases how consumption, water consumption changes across quintiles, you see that there are not that many cases where the difference between quintile 1 and quintile 3 are that large, or between quintile 1 and quintile 5. In fact, there are even some cases where we have higher consumption levels amongst the poorest than we do amongst others. Now, why might that be? Well, there are numbers of reasons why poor households might be expected to use more water than others. A common example is when you have multiple poor households sharing one water connection. If they share one water connection, then their total monthly bill or their total monthly consumption will be much higher than another household where you just have one household on one connection, even if they have fewer household fixtures. So it's actually not as strange as it may seem to say that poor households don't have very high or don't have very low water consumption. So if poor households are not necessarily low volume consumers, then this would mean that using quantity targeting to try to reach the poor and exclude the non-poor probably won't work very well. Now, what you might call the good news is that because in practice increasing block tariffs are usually combined with general subsidies for all residential customers, in practice hardly anyone is excluded. So that poor household that is actually, or say, let's say the 5 poor households that are working together, have one connection together, and have very high consumption as a result, probably still get a subsidy, because just about everyone gets a subsidy. Here is an example of an increasing block tariff, the one I showed you earlier, where I've indicated that, let's say, average cost is $1. In this case, then, households consuming in the first 3 blocks of consumption are actually receiving subsidies for all of that consumption. It's only the households that consume more than 300 cubic meters a month who actually start to pay more than average cost. This is just one example, but it's typical of what you see. But this would mean that even poor households, say, consuming 200 cubic meters a month would still receive a large subsidy in this case. This good news, though, isn't really good news. First, because it means that non-poor households are also not excluded from the subsidies, which means that the total subsidy budget is larger than it would otherwise be, which may make it less politically sustainable, for one, and it certainly makes it more expensive. The other thing is that in the long term, utilities that don't get reimbursed for providing subsidies to residential customers are likely to have poor quality service because they can't do maintenance, and are unlikely to expand their service because they don't have money for expansion. What this means for the poor is that though the poor who are already more likely not to be connected may have to wait even longer to get connections. So although this, in a way, is good news, the poor are going to get subsidies just like everyone else, we're talking about a small number of poor households, not those who aren't connected, and even those who do get the subsidy may get it at the cost of poor quality service. Let's move on now to who receives the largest subsidies. So we've talked now about why some households don't get subsidies. Now let's think about, amongst those households who do qualify for subsidies and do receive subsidies, who gets the largest subsidies. And here I'm going to focus on consumption subsidies that are delivered through increasing block tariffs. First, how large of a discount do the subsidy beneficiaries receive? In the case of an increasing block tariff, the size of the discount depends on how much water you use. So again, looking at our increasing block tariff example, you see that households that consume in the first block are receiving an 80% discount on each block of water, each cubic meter of water they use. Once you get to the second block, in this case, they're receiving about a 55% discount for every additional unit. In the third block, they receive a 35% discount, and in the final block, they are paying a 20% surcharge. This means that as your consumption increases, the average discount per unit that you receive goes down. So as we would hope, or as we would expect, it is low volume consumers who receive the largest average discount. There is an important exception to this, though, and that is when there is a fixed fee or a minimum consumption rule in the tariff. Let's say you have a fixed fee of, say, $1. A household that's consuming here in the lowest block would have to pay that $1, plus would receive then the 80% discount on his first 10 units. This can often mean that the actual average discount or average price paid by the lowest volume consumers is higher than for others because of the fixed fee. But if there's no fixed fee, then it is true that the largest average discount goes to the lowest volume consumers. That doesn't mean, though, that the lowest volume consumers actually get the largest subsidy.